The right to vote is under attack in America. Across the country, Republican-led legislatures are enacting laws that make it harder to cast a ballot. These measures, often justified in the name of election security, disproportionately disenfranchise people of color, the poor, and the elderly. Now, a new threat to voting rights has emerged: the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility (SAVE) Act. This federal legislation, recently passed by the House of Representatives, would impose onerous documentation requirements for voter registration, potentially disenfranchising millions of eligible voters. The SAVE Act is a solution in search of a problem. Voter fraud is exceedingly rare in the United States. There is no evidence of widespread fraud that would justify the sweeping restrictions imposed by this bill. Instead, the SAVE Act appears designed to suppress the vote, particularly among groups that tend to vote Democratic. Its passage is a dangerous escalation in the Republican assault on voting rights. The SAVE Act, passed by the House of Representatives on April 10, 2025, mandates proof of U.S. citizenship for federal voter registration. This seemingly innocuous requirement has far-reaching consequences. Under the bill, prospective voters must present specific documents such as passports, government-issued photo IDs, and birth certificates to register to vote. These documents must precisely match the information on their voter registration applications. While supporters argue that this measure is necessary to prevent non-citizen voting, critics contend that it is a thinly veiled attempt to suppress voter turnout. The Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan law and policy institute, estimates that over 21 million Americans lack easy access to citizenship documents. This burden falls disproportionately on low-income Americans, people of color, and the elderly. Moreover, the SAVE Act imposes strict penalties on election officials who register individuals without the required documentation, creating a chilling effect that could further disenfranchise eligible voters. The SAVE Act's documentation requirements pose a particular challenge for married women who have changed their names. These women often face significant hurdles in obtaining the necessary documents to register to vote. They may need to track down decades-old marriage certificates or navigate bureaucratic mazes to update their identification documents. The process can be time-consuming, expensive, and ultimately insurmountable for some women. Consider the case of Sarah Jones, a hypothetical resident of New Hampshire who recently moved and attempted to register to vote. Sarah, who took her husband's last name after marriage, was unable to register because her driver's license and birth certificate did not match her current name. She was told she needed to provide her marriage certificate, which she had misplaced years ago. Without it, Sarah was unable to exercise her fundamental right to vote. Sarah's story is not unique. Millions of women across the country face similar obstacles to voter registration due to name changes. The SAVE Act exacerbates these challenges, creating an unacceptable barrier to the ballot box for countless eligible voters. Representative Deborah Ross, a Democrat from North Carolina, estimates that the SAVE Act could disenfranchise up to 69 million women. This is not merely a hypothetical concern. A similar proof of citizenship law in Kansas, enacted in 2011, prevented over 31,000 eligible voters from registering to vote before it was struck down by a federal judge in 2018. The SAVE Act's impact on married women is just one example of its discriminatory potential. The bill's onerous documentation requirements threaten to disenfranchise a wide range of eligible voters, including young people who may not yet have driver's licenses, senior citizens who no longer drive, and transgender individuals whose identification documents may not reflect their current gender identity. By making it harder for these groups to vote, the SAVE Act undermines the very foundation of our democracy. Section 5. The Specter of Voter Fraud. Supporters of the SAVE Act argue that it is necessary to prevent voter fraud and ensure the integrity of our elections. They claim that the bill's documentation requirements will deter non-citizens from voting and maintain accurate voter rolls. However, there is no evidence to support these claims. In fact, voter fraud is vanishingly rare in the United States. A comprehensive study by Loyola Law School professor Justin Levitt found only 31 credible instances of voter impersonation fraud out of more than 1 billion ballots cast between 2000 and 2014. These findings are consistent with numerous other studies that have debunked the myth of widespread voter fraud. The Brennan Center for Justice, for example, analyzed hundreds of alleged cases of voter fraud in Texas and found that the vast majority were the result of clerical errors or other administrative problems, not intentional wrongdoing. Section 6. A flimsy justification. The lack of evidence for widespread voter fraud exposes the SAVE Act for what it is: a solution in search of a problem. The bill's true purpose is not to protect the integrity of our elections, but to suppress voter turnout among groups that tend to vote Democratic. This is a cynical and dangerous tactic that undermines the very foundation of our democracy. The SAVE Act is part of a broader Republican assault on voting rights. In recent years, Republican-led legislatures across the country have enacted a wave of restrictive voting laws, including voter ID laws, cuts to early voting, and purges of voter rolls. These laws disproportionately disenfranchise people of color, the poor, and the elderly. The SAVE Act is just the latest and perhaps most egregious example of this trend. Section 7. Echoes of Jim Crow. The SAVE Act's targeting of married women is particularly troubling. It evokes the poll taxes and literacy tests that were used to disenfranchise black voters during the Jim Crow era. These measures were designed to be race-neutral on their face, but in practice, they were applied in a discriminatory manner to prevent black Americans from exercising their right to vote. Similarly, the SAVE Act's documentation requirements may appear neutral at first glance, but their impact falls disproportionately on women, particularly women of color. This is no coincidence. Women, and particularly women of color, are a crucial voting bloc that has helped to elect Democrats in recent elections. By making it harder for these women to vote, Republicans are seeking to tilt the electoral playing field in their favor. Section 8. A political battleground. The SAVE Act has become a political battleground, with Democrats and Republicans squaring off over its implications for voting rights. The bill passed the House of Representatives on a largely party-line vote, with all but 4 Democrats voting against it. However, its fate in the Senate remains uncertain. Democrats are united in their opposition to the bill, and they are vowing to block it from becoming law. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has called the SAVE Act a blatant attempt to suppress the vote and has vowed to use every tool at our disposal to defeat it. Democrats are hoping to rally public opposition to the bill and pressure Republicans to drop their support. They are also exploring legal challenges to the bill if it becomes law. Section 9. The fight for the future of voting rights. The SAVE Act represents a crossroads for voting rights in America. If it becomes law, it will have a chilling effect on voter participation, particularly among women, people of color, and the poor. It will further erode trust in our democracy and make it even harder to ensure that every vote is counted. However, the fight is far from over. Civil rights organizations, voting rights advocates, and concerned citizens are mobilizing to oppose the SAVE Act and protect the right to vote for all Americans. They are organizing protests, contacting their elected officials, and challenging the bill in court. The outcome of this fight will have profound implications for the future of our democracy. The right to vote is fundamental to a free and fair society. We must do everything in our power to protect it. The Cherry Blossom Open, a major fencing tournament held in Maryland, became the epicenter of a national debate in early April 2025. Stephanie Turner, a female fencer, refused to compete against Redmond Sullivan, a transgender woman. Turner's protest, taking a knee during their scheduled match, resulted in her disqualification. Her actions brought to light the simmering controversy surrounding USA Fencing's transgender inclusion policy. Turner's protest was not about Sullivan personally, rather, it was a direct challenge to the policy that allowed Sullivan to compete in the women's division. This incident forced a national conversation about the complex issues of gender identity, athletic fairness, and the rights of transgender individuals in sports. The Cherry Blossom Open became a flashpoint, but the roots of this controversy run much deeper, touching upon societal anxieties, political maneuvering, and the very definition of fairness in competition. The coming weeks and months would determine whether this incident would serve as a catalyst for understanding or further division. Stephanie Turner, in her own words, was standing up for what she believed in. "I am a woman, and this is a man," she stated after her disqualification, "and this is a women's tournament." Her protest, she maintained, was not about hate, but about protecting the integrity of women's sports. Turner argued that transgender women, having gone through male puberty, have an unfair advantage over cisgender women. This advantage, she argued, undermines fair play and threatens the future of women's athletics. Turner's stance resonated with a growing number of athletes and voices across the country who shared her concerns. Turner's actions, however, came with a cost. She faced immediate disqualification and the potential for further sanctions from USA Fencing. More significantly, she risked being ostracized by a sport she loved. Despite the backlash, Turner remained steadfast in her convictions, becoming a symbol for those opposed to transgender inclusion in women's sports. Her protest, regardless of one's stance on the issue, highlighted the deep divisions and the very real human consequences of this ongoing debate. USA Fencing found itself at the heart of a storm. The organization's transgender inclusion policy, enacted in 2023, allows athletes to compete based on their gender identity. This policy, they argued, was rooted in principles of inclusivity and aimed to create a safe and welcoming environment for all athletes regardless of gender identity. USA Fencing defended its policy, citing current research and medical consensus on transgender athletes. They emphasized their commitment to fostering a sport that is open and accessible to everyone. Their position aligned with the International Olympic Committee's guidelines on transgender participation, which prioritize inclusion and individual rights. However, the organization faced a wave of backlash following Turner's protest. Critics argued that the policy, while well-intentioned, failed to consider the potential for unfair competitive advantages. They questioned the scientific basis for the policy and accused USA Fencing of prioritizing ideology over fair play. USA Fencing maintained that their policy was open to review and potential amendments based on evolving scientific understanding or changes in IOC guidelines. However, they remained resolute in their commitment to inclusivity, setting the stage for a protracted battle over the future of transgender athletes in the sport. The controversy surrounding USA Fencing's transgender inclusion policy quickly escalated beyond the world of sports, attracting the attention of politicians and lawmakers. On April 8, 2025, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton announced an investigation into USA Fencing for potential violations of Texas consumer protection laws. Paxton, a vocal critic of transgender rights, argued that USA Fencing's policy was misleading to athletes and the public. He contended that the policy, by allowing transgender women to compete against cisgender women, created a false impression of a level playing field. Paxton's investigation aimed to determine whether USA Fencing's policy constituted deceptive practices under Texas law. This investigation, though focused on USA Fencing, represented a broader push by conservative lawmakers across the country to challenge transgender inclusion in sports. Paxton's actions signaled a willingness to use legal means to enforce a particular view of gender and fairness in athletics, potentially setting a precedent for similar actions in other states. The investigation, regardless of its outcome, added another layer of complexity to the debate, injecting legal ramifications into an already heated controversy. The political pressure on USA Fencing intensified when Senator Ted Cruz, chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, issued a letter demanding the organization retract its transgender inclusion policy. Cruz, a staunch conservative and ally of former President Trump, argued that the policy violated the spirit of fair competition and threatened the integrity of women's sports. Cruz's letter cited President Trump's executive order banning transgender athletes from women's sports as justification for his stance. He warned USA Fencing that their continued defiance of this order could jeopardize their status as a national governing body, potentially resulting in a loss of federal funding and recognition. Cruz's ultimatum placed USA Fencing in a precarious position. The organization faced a difficult choice: comply with political pressure and potentially alienate a portion of their athletes, or stand by their policy and risk losing vital funding and recognition. This high-stakes standoff underscored the politicization of transgender rights and the increasing pressure on sporting bodies to navigate this complex and divisive issue. Looming over the controversy was former President Donald Trump's executive order banning transgender women from competing in women's sports. Signed in February 2025, the order was a victory for conservative groups advocating for the ban. It threatened to withhold federal funding from non-compliant schools and organizations. The University of Pennsylvania faced a $175 million funding freeze for supporting transgender athletes. This highlighted the consequences for defying the Trump administration's stance. Trump's order continued to influence the national conversation on transgender rights in sports. It emboldened conservative lawmakers and activists, shaping the political landscape. The order's long-term impact on transgender athletes remained uncertain but significant. Facing mounting pressure from politicians, threats of legal action, and the specter of lost funding, USA Fencing found itself at a crossroads. However, the organization, while acknowledging the complexities of the situation, refused to buckle under pressure. They chose to stand by their commitment to inclusivity, walking a tightrope between defending their policy and seeking to appease their detractors. In response to Senator Cruz's letter, USA Fencing declined to comment directly but reiterated their dedication to creating a welcoming and inclusive environment for all athletes. They emphasized their willingness to engage in constructive dialogue with stakeholders, including policymakers, athletes, and medical experts. However, they remained steadfast in their refusal to compromise the core principles of their policy. Their response, while measured, signaled a determination to chart their own course, balancing the demands of inclusivity with the realities of the political landscape. Whether this delicate balancing act would prove sustainable in the long run remained to be seen. However, in that moment, USA Fencing chose to prioritize the well-being and inclusion of all their athletes, drawing a line in the sand and refusing to be swayed by political pressure. The controversy surrounding USA Fencing's transgender inclusion policy mirrors a larger national debate. Transgender rights in sports have become a flashpoint, exposing deep divisions about fairness and inclusion. Some argue transgender women should compete according to their gender identity, emphasizing inclusivity. They highlight the mental and emotional well-being of transgender youth. Others argue transgender women have an unfair advantage due to physiological factors. They frame their arguments as protecting women's sports. The debate, often heated, plays out in media, legislatures, and courtrooms. It highlights the complexities of gender identity and the need for respectful dialogue. The controversy surrounding USA Fencing's transgender inclusion policy, while deeply divisive, offered an opportunity for reflection and growth. It forced a national conversation about the rights of transgender individuals, the meaning of fairness in sports, and the challenges of building a more inclusive society. Finding common ground in this debate required empathy, understanding, and a willingness to engage in respectful dialogue. Moving forward, it was essential to prioritize the well-being and dignity of transgender athletes. Policies and regulations should be grounded in scientific evidence, medical consensus, and a commitment to creating a level playing field while ensuring that transgender athletes are not unfairly excluded. The path forward would not be easy. However, by embracing the principles of inclusivity, fairness, and respect, it was possible to create a sporting landscape where all athletes, regardless of gender identity, could thrive and compete to the best of their abilities. The USA Fencing controversy, while painful and divisive, had the potential to serve as a catalyst for positive change, reminding us that the pursuit of athletic excellence should be a source of unity, not division. From the bustling streets of Mumbai, where the air is thick with the chants of determined citizens, to the historic avenues of Washington, D.C., where the echoes of past movements resonate with today's cries for justice, a wave of protests has swept across the globe, uniting people from diverse backgrounds in a common cause. Citizens are raising their voices in unison, demanding change and challenging the policies of their governments. They are no longer willing to remain silent. These mass demonstrations, fueled by a potent mix of economic anxieties, social grievances, and political polarization, are a testament to the enduring power of public outcry in the face of perceived injustice. The sheer number of participants highlights the widespread discontent. Whether sparked by labor reforms, social welfare cuts, or allegations of corruption, these movements are diverse yet interconnected. These protests underscore the vital role of citizen engagement in holding power to account. They remind us that democracy thrives on active participation. These protests are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger, global narrative. They represent a broader trend of citizens worldwide, asserting their rights and demanding a say in the decisions that impact their lives. This is a powerful reminder of the collective strength of the people. The scale and intensity of these demonstrations serve as a stark reminder that governments cannot ignore the concerns of their people indefinitely. The voices of the masses are a force to be reckoned with. In India, a storm of controversy has erupted over the government's new labor codes, which have been met with fierce opposition from various quarters. These codes, enacted in 2019, have become a flashpoint for workers' rights, sparking widespread protests and strikes across the nation. The discontent is palpable as workers from various sectors unite in their demand for justice. Trade unions argue that the codes are a blatant attack on hard-won labor protections, eroding job security, and paving the way for exploitation. They believe that these changes will dismantle decades of progress in labor rights. They contend that the new regulations make it easier for companies to hire and fire workers at will, undermining the bargaining power of unions and leaving workers vulnerable to unfair treatment. This has led to a surge in union activities and mobilizations. The government, however, maintains that the new codes are essential for modernizing India's outdated labor laws and boosting economic growth. They argue that the reforms will attract foreign investment, create new jobs, and improve the competitiveness of Indian businesses in the global market. The government insists that the codes strike a balance between the interests of workers and employers, ensuring both flexibility and fairness in the workplace. The debate continues as both sides present their arguments, each convinced of their stance. Across the Atlantic, the United States has witnessed its own wave of protests, under the banner of Hands Off. This multifaceted movement, fueled by a coalition of activist groups and concerned citizens, is pushing back against a range of policies enacted by the Trump administration. A central grievance is the government's drastic downsizing and privatization of public services, including healthcare, social security, and education. Protesters argue that these cuts disproportionately impact the most vulnerable segments of society, eroding the social safety net and exacerbating inequality. The hands-off movement also denounces the administration's rollback of LGBTQ+ protections and its perceived attacks on reproductive rights. Demonstrations have not been confined to American soil, with solidarity protests erupting in European cities as well. Meanwhile, in the southern Indian state of Karnataka, the political landscape has been roiled by the Bharatiya Janata Party's BJP Janakrosh Yatra, a protest march aimed at the ruling Congress government. The BJP accuses the Congress of rampant corruption, alleging misappropriation of welfare funds and preferential treatment of certain religious groups through reservation policies. The BJP has also seized on rising inflation as a key point of contention, blaming the Congress government's mismanagement of the economy for the plight of ordinary citizens struggling with the soaring cost of essential goods. The Congress, however, has vehemently denied these allegations, accusing the BJP of indulging in politically motivated smear campaigns to destabilize the government. Karnataka's chief minister has hit back at the BJP, pointing fingers at the central government's policies, particularly the recent fuel price hikes, as the primary drivers of inflation. Section 5. Government responses, from dismissal to dialogue. The responses of governments to these protests have varied widely. from outright dismissal and attempts at suppression to measured engagement and promises of dialogue. In India, the government's response to the labor code protests has been met with criticism from labor unions and activists. While the government has engaged in some discussions with union leaders, it has so far refused to repeal or significantly amend the contentious codes. In the United States, the Trump administration has largely dismissed the hands-off protests, accusing organizers of being partisan actors seeking to undermine the government. The White House has defended its policies, arguing that they are necessary for fiscal responsibility and economic growth. In Karnataka, the Congress government has adopted a more confrontational stance, accusing the BJP of playing politics with people's lives. Section 6. Common Threads, Economic Anxiety and Political Polarization. Despite their geographical and contextual differences, these protests share some striking commonalities. A recurring theme is the growing sense of economic insecurity and anxiety felt by many citizens. Whether it's the fear of losing jobs and labor protections in India, the anxiety over cuts to social safety nets in the United States, or the struggle to cope with rising inflation in Karnataka, these protests highlight the very real economic challenges faced by ordinary people. Another common thread is the deepening political polarization that has come to characterize many democracies worldwide. These protests are not merely about specific policies but also reflect broader societal divisions and the erosion of trust in institutions. The language used by both protesters and governments often reveals a starkly polarized political landscape, making compromise and constructive dialogue increasingly difficult. Section 7. Points of Departure, Localized Grievances and Global Resonances. While sharing common threads, these protests also exhibit unique characteristics rooted in their specific contexts. Each movement is shaped by the unique socio-political and economic landscapes of their respective regions, making them distinct yet interconnected. The labor code protests in India, for instance, are deeply intertwined with the country's complex labor market, characterized by a vast informal sector and a long history of struggle for workers' rights. These protests highlight the ongoing battle for fair wages, job security, and better working conditions in a rapidly changing economy. The hands-off protests in the United States, on the other hand, reflect the country's ongoing debate over the role of government, individual liberties, and social welfare programs. These demonstrations underscore the tension between federal authority and personal freedoms, a recurring theme in American history. The BJP's protest march in Karnataka is emblematic of the intense political rivalry between the BJP and the Congress, playing out against the backdrop of regional identities, religious tensions, and allegations of corruption. This rivalry is not just a political contest but a reflection of deeper societal divides and aspirations. Despite their localized origins, these protests also hold global resonance. They serve as a reminder that the fight for justice, equality, and human rights transcends borders. They reflect a broader trend of citizens worldwide mobilizing against perceived injustices, demanding greater accountability from their leaders, and asserting their right to shape their own destinies. This global wave of activism highlights the interconnectedness of our struggles and the universal desire for a more just and equitable world. Section 8. The Potential Impact, Shaping Public Discourse and Policy Agendas. The potential impact of these protests on society and politics is significant. At the very least, these demonstrations have succeeded in bringing critical issues to the forefront of public discourse. They have forced governments to address concerns that they might have otherwise preferred to ignore. The protests have also empowered citizens, reminding them of their collective strength and their ability to hold power to account. Whether these protests will lead to concrete policy changes remains to be seen. However, they have undoubtedly shifted the political calculus, making it more difficult for governments to enact unpopular measures without facing significant backlash. The protests have also highlighted the importance of dialogue and compromise in addressing complex societal issues. Section 9. Conclusion. A world in flux, united by dissent. In conclusion, the recent wave of protests across the globe is a testament to the enduring power of citizen activism in a world grappling with rapid change and uncertainty. From the streets of India to the heart of America, citizens are making their voices heard, demanding a say in shaping their future. While the outcomes of these protests remain uncertain, one thing is clear: the world is witnessing a resurgence of civic engagement driven by a shared desire for a more just, equitable, and responsive system of governance. As governments and citizens navigate this complex and evolving landscape, the ability to engage in constructive dialogue, bridge divides, and find common ground will be paramount in determining the trajectory of these movements and their lasting impact on society. April 11, 2025, marked a significant escalation in the ongoing US-China trade war. China raised tariffs on a wide range of US goods to 125%. This move comes as a direct response to the existing 145% tariffs levied by the United States on Chinese imports. The tariff battle, which began in 2018, has intensified with no clear resolution in sight. Both nations seem entrenched in their positions, raising concerns about the global economic impact. This latest development has sent shockwaves through global markets, deepening fears of a full-blown trade war. Businesses and consumers alike are bracing for the consequences of higher prices and economic uncertainty. The trade war's ripple effects are being felt far beyond the borders of the US and China, impacting global supply chains and international relations. The situation underscores the interconnectedness of the global economy and the potential for significant disruption when major players engage in protectionist policies. While both sides have hinted at the possibility of a negotiated settlement, the path forward remains unclear. As the trade war drags on, the stakes for the global economy continue to rise. The current tariff standoff is the culmination of years of escalating trade tensions between the world's two largest economies. It began in 2018 with the Trump administration imposing tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, citing national security concerns. China retaliated with tariffs of its own, targeting American agricultural products. This back-and-forth exchange of tariffs has become a hallmark of the US-China trade relationship. Each round of tariffs has been met with a counter-response, creating a cycle of retaliation that has done little to address the underlying trade imbalances. The trade war has expanded beyond tariffs, encompassing technology transfer, intellectual property rights, and market access. Both sides accuse the other of unfair trade practices and economic espionage. The lack of trust and communication has made finding common ground increasingly difficult. As the trade war enters its 8th year, the economic costs are mounting for both countries. Businesses are facing higher costs, consumers are paying more for goods, and uncertainty is hindering investment and growth. China views the US actions as unilateral bullying and coercion designed to stifle its economic rise. Beijing argues that the US has unfairly targeted Chinese companies and imposed unreasonable trade barriers. They maintain that their trade practices are in line with international norms and that they are open to dialogue based on mutual respect and equality. However, China has also demonstrated its willingness to respond in kind to US pressure. The recent tariff increase is a clear signal that Beijing will not back down from defending its economic interests. They have also diversified their trade partners, strengthening ties with other Asian countries, Africa, and Europe. Despite the tough talk, China also recognizes the potential damage a protracted trade war could inflict on its economy. They are particularly vulnerable to disruptions in the global supply chain and a decline in demand for Chinese goods. China's response has been a calculated mix of defiance and pragmatism. They are seeking to project strength and resolve while also leaving the door open for negotiations. In a significant diplomatic move, Chinese President Xi Jinping has called on the European Union to resist US bullying and work with China to maintain global economic stability. During a meeting with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, Xi emphasized that there are no winners in a tariff war. This appeal to the EU highlights China's efforts to build a united front against what it perceives as US protectionism. The EU, itself caught in the crossfire of the trade war, has been critical of both US and Chinese trade practices. The EU has so far pursued a cautious approach, pausing its own retaliatory tariffs against the US. However, the escalating trade war and Xi's call for collaboration put the EU in a difficult position. The EU must weigh its economic interests and its commitment to free trade against the pressure to align with the US. China's overture presents an opportunity for the EU to assert its role as a global economic power and potentially mediate a resolution to the trade dispute. The escalating trade war has sent shockwaves through global financial markets, reflecting growing anxiety about the potential for a global economic slowdown. Asian markets were hit particularly hard, with Japan's Nikkei index plummeting nearly 5%. Hong Kong stocks experienced their largest weekly decline since the 2008 financial crisis. Oil prices also tumbled for the second consecutive week, as investors worried about declining global demand. European markets followed suit, with major indices like the FTSE 100 CAC 40 and DAX all closing lower. Even the US market, which had initially shown resilience, succumbed to the negative sentiment. The S&P 500 dropped 3.5% on Thursday and is down approximately 15% from its February peak. The US dollar also weakened, reaching a three-year low as investors sought safer assets. The market turmoil is a clear indication of the global economic uncertainty fueled by the US-China trade war. Investors are concerned about the impact on corporate profits, global supply chains, and consumer spending. The escalating trade war has intensified fears of a global recession, with economists warning of the potential for a significant economic downturn. Goldman Sachs, a leading global investment bank, estimates a 45% probability of a recession within the next year. The trade war is seen as a major contributing factor to the slowing global economy. The uncertainty surrounding trade policy is discouraging investment and hindering business expansion. The higher tariffs are also increasing costs for businesses and consumers, leading to reduced spending and economic activity. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon has warned of considerable turbulence in the U.S. economy, citing trade tensions as a significant risk factor. The UN Trade Agency has also sounded the alarm, warning of a catastrophic impact on developing countries, which are particularly vulnerable to disruptions in global trade. Yale researchers note that the U.S. average import duty rate is now the highest in over a century, highlighting the extent to which the U.S. has embraced protectionist policies. This trend is further fueling concerns about a global trade war and its potential to derail the global economy. As the US-China trade war intensifies, other countries are reassessing their trade relationships and seeking to capitalize on the shifting geopolitical landscape. Vietnam, for example, has agreed to formal trade talks with the US and has pledged to crack down on Chinese goods being rerouted through its territory. Taiwan, facing a 32% tariff on its exports to the US, has offered zero tariffs as a basis for trade negotiations with Washington. Japan has also formed a task force to discuss trade with the US, seeking to secure favorable terms for its exports. These developments highlight the opportunities and challenges presented by the US-China trade war. While the trade dispute has created uncertainty and disruption, it has also opened the door for other countries to strengthen their economic ties with the US. The US, for its part, is actively seeking to diversify its trade partners and reduce its reliance on China. The Trump administration has reportedly engaged in trade talks with over 75 countries. The US-China trade war extends far beyond tariffs, encompassing a wide range of economic and technological issues. China has taken steps to restrict Hollywood film imports, limiting access to its lucrative entertainment market. Furthermore, China has placed 18 US companies on trade restriction lists, citing national security concerns. These actions highlight China's willingness to use non-tariff barriers to retaliate against US pressure and protect its domestic industries. The trade war has also spilled over into the realm of technology, with both countries vying for dominance in areas like artificial intelligence, 5G networks, and quantum computing. The US has taken steps to restrict Chinese technology companies like Huawei, citing national security risks. China, in turn, is aggressively pursuing its own technological advancements, seeking to reduce its reliance on US technology and establish itself as a global leader in innovation. The competition between the US and China in the technological sphere is likely to intensify, with significant implications for global economic and geopolitical power. The US-China trade war presents a complex and multifaceted challenge to the global economy and international relations. The escalating tariffs, market volatility, and recession fears underscore the high stakes involved. While both sides have expressed a willingness to negotiate a trade deal, significant obstacles remain. The lack of trust, competing economic interests, and domestic political considerations make finding a mutually acceptable solution difficult. The potential long-term consequences of the trade war are significant. A protracted trade war could lead to a decoupling of the US and Chinese economies, fragmenting global supply chains and hindering global economic growth. It could also exacerbate geopolitical tensions, undermining international cooperation and increasing the risk of conflict. Navigating the complexities of the US-China trade war will require careful diplomacy, economic pragmatism, and a commitment to multilateral solutions. The global community must work together to mitigate the risks of a trade war and promote a more stable and prosperous global economic order.